Hello and welcome back to the World Traveler Cooking podcast series on the Russo-Ukraine War. Now, in the first one on this series, we talked about the need to move towards a just peace. In the last one, we talked about the role that internal divisions and crises within Ukraine have played in this ongoing crisis. Now it's time for us to turn our eye towards Russia and look at the role they're playing. I still believe that the internal crises within the Ukrainian state itself define this conflict. But although they also make it inevitable, they don't make what's happening now or likely to happen based on all the information we have inevitable. It's my belief that while Russia clearly has some real and valid security concerns about Ukraine, the actions that they're taking are ones which undermine everybody's interests in the region, including those, in fact, of Russia. So I think it's really important to try to cut through the propaganda, to try to figure out what those interests actually are, and try to require that we come together as an international community and negotiate on the valid interests in order to move towards a just peace. Now, let's start with watching this crisis develop as one would in, for example, an attempt through Russian eyes. You see a country on your border, a very large one, second largest country in Europe behind Russia. A balance of power between sort of, if you will, pro-Eurasian groups within Russia and pro-European and Atlanticist groups within Russia has been disturbed in the Maidan Revolution. You see a civil war develop over the question of language use. And you see efforts to try to incorporate Ukraine into what's pretty clearly a hostile military alliance, being NATO. Now, a lot of people will say, well, calling NATO a hostile military alliance is just playing into Russian propaganda. But we have to, as I say, look at things from the facts. And the fact is that NATO started to try to contain the Soviet Union. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States, in particular, used NATO to try to contain Russia. And this happened not only during Putin, but also during Yeltsin. The incident involving the Pristina airport is actually a very good example, because what had happened there was Yeltsin had engaged in a lot of efforts to diplomatically to allow NATO forces to intervene in Kosovo. And then the United States, in particular, used NATO to shut Russia out of any peacekeeping in the area in any major way. In other words, we repaid their help with basically trying to geopolitically limit their influence. And I don't think Russians have forgotten about that. Additionally, this is a good case where NATO used armed forces to try to change borders. I don't see the Kosovo question as fundamentally different from the Crimean question, for example. And, but at any rate, it shows both NATO hostility towards Russia, and we'll come back to that question when it comes to the United States' influence. But point is, Russia is very valid in seeing NATO as a hostile military alliance, particularly due to the United States' influence. And this is a very big deal. The second issue is, if you look at the distance from Moscow to the Ukrainian border, this is such that the S-400 and S-500 air and missile defense systems could strike large targets on the Ukrainian border from the outskirts of Moscow. What this means is if you actually have a conflict where NATO is an active party and trying to maintain air supremacy, they would have to roll back air and missile defenses all the way to the nation's capital. Probably beyond it, since these units are mobile. That is an existential threat in a nuclear age. So, if you were looking at this, and for Americans in the audience, imagine that Mexico was exploring security arrangements with China. That's the kind of threat that we'd be talking about. On top of this, they're aware that during the Civil War, efforts at negotiating a settlement have been heavily undermined by the military. The military had refused to follow ceasefire orders, for example. We have video of Zelensky arguing with military officers about that. Imagine, as an American, looking at Mexico, and imagine that the Mexican army was vehemently pro-Chinese and refusing to follow ceasefire orders from the elected government. That's the kind of threat that that Russia has to see in this developing situation. And so, as I said before, I think that this very much makes this conflict inevitable. But what is not inevitable about it is the way in which it's going to go forward. And the great fear I have is that Russia is almost certainly going to do several things. The first one is, in order to assure water to Crimea, they will annex the Kherson Oblast. This is, make no mistake about it, in part the first war over water that I know of outside the Middle East. And access to fresh water is a very important aspect of this. The weaponization of fresh water to the Crimean population is a particular problem here. And that's, again, something that will have to be addressed. The second thing I think that Russia would do is push for the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk and annex those effectively over into republics within the Russian Federation. And then they would probably declare victory until the war continues and they basically start taking more territory. The end result could very well be a Ukraine where those areas which have historically primarily spoken Russian at home are effectively moved into the Russian Federation, and the areas which have historically spoken Ukrainian at home are left as part of a hyper-nationalist Ukrainian state with no political counterbalance. The reason why this is so dangerous is that if you do this, what you end up with is a hyper-radicalized, hyper-nationalist state which will exist in a state of continuous war with Russia. In the event where that happens, the state is very likely to have trouble controlling its own people, as we know, and its own armed forces, as we know Ukraine today is already having trouble doing. You're likely to see continued efforts at recruiting foreign fighters. And those foreign fighters today, because of a number of factors, are predominantly coming from the right wings of Western society. So what this means is you're going to get a whole bunch of militant right-wingers going to Ukraine. Then they'll go back to Australia. They'll go back to New Zealand. They'll go back to the United States. They'll go back to countries in Western Europe, and they'll take with them their military training. They will take with them contacts relating to obtaining weapons or explosives. And you're going to get the same kind of menace that we saw in Afghanistan after the Soviets left. And that will threaten everybody. It will threaten Russia, it will threaten the West. And that's something that really, therefore, can't be allowed to happen. See, both internally and externally, politics depends upon balance of power. So, if you disturb that balance of power, as the United States did in supporting the Svoboda contingent within and the SNA contingent in Maidan, what you're going to end up with is a situation where there are a lot of problems following, where the urge to dominate becomes first and foremost, and the ability to coexist goes away. And part of what I'm saying here is that if Russia continues to do down the path that they're going right now, they are less able to coexist with Ukraine, because they will redefine the Ukrainian state to be one which is more and more and more unbalanced in a particular political direction. This is why I said in the last video that territorial integrity of Ukraine was vital coming out of this, because of internal political reasons. So, what Russia's done really over the last, pretty much since 2014 really, is Russia's been heavily involved in trying to create a compliant Ukraine in some respects, or if you can't do that, then a divided and ineffectual Ukraine. Not that Ukraine has needed help to get to the divided and ineffectual side, we talked about that last week, but this has been sort of the geopolitical direction. And I think where it comes from is the fact that large powers, Russia, the United States both, tend to over-trust in their own force, and they tend to over-trust in their own abilities, and they tend not to understand that if you don't make sure that when you come in, everybody's going to remember you as the good guys, that it's going to be very difficult to make allies later. So this is very, very much a dysfunction of major power, and it's even more evident when we talk about like the United States' role. But the thing that's absolutely necessary at this point is to recognize that Russia has a very serious problem on their borders. That there is no place in a modern state for an army that will not lay down their arms when told to by the civilian government. And that Russia, like every other country in the world, is not going to tolerate, any more than they have to, a hostile encroachment by a hostile military alliance on their borders, particularly one where the strings are being pulled by a country which has sought over and over and over to contain them since at least, World War I. And in that regard, I'm referring to the United States. So we need a negotiation on a new security framework. We need a negotiation that ensures that the Crimean Peninsula and the people on it are part of the Ukrainian political community. What that looks like afterwards, I don't have a major opinion, but that's absolutely necessary. That'll have to be negotiated between the Republic of Crimea and the Republic of Ukraine. And probably Russia also. There has to be a recognition that these divisions within Ukraine are real and that they have to be worked to get through together by Ukrainians across the political spectrum. So I believe the following things are required. I believe that it is vitally necessary to understand that at the end of this conflict, all of the concerning powers, that includes the EU, it includes NATO, it includes the United States, it includes Ukraine, and it includes Russia, have to be willing to sit down and figure out how to make sure that Ukraine as a country can survive with a viable balance of power internally in order to prevent wild swings to the right and wild swings to the left. And that has to include, as I say, territorial integrity for Ukraine. And that's as important for Russia as it is for anybody else. The second thing that's vitally important here is that we recognize that Russia's efforts since 2014 to carve out Russian majority parts of Ukraine into separate countries and remove them from the political community of Ukraine is a disaster waiting to happen. And it is a disaster precisely because the Ukrainian right is strengthened by such measures. And the final point is that we have to figure out how to negotiate an overarching security structure, which includes Russia in the future of Eurasian security. Because if we can't do those things, then what we're going to end up with is a perpetual war in Ukraine, which results in Russia slowly taking over all pieces of the country, because there will be no alternative. And that's not good for Ukraine. I don't feel like it's good for Russia either. And it's going to cause a lot of problems everywhere else. Now, as I've said before in this series, I don't spare any side or any group criticism in terms of this war. My view on Russia is that they are taking a bad situation that they do have to react to in some way, and they are making it catastrophically worse. And if we end up in a situation where a Western Ukrainian state becomes a nexus point for right-wing violence, that we will have Russia to blame for that. Unlike Ukraine, which is a victim of its own history and a victim of its own divisions, Russia is able to act as a rational actor here. And so the country has a sense of agency that places a kind of burden on them in terms of action that I don't believe is being met very well. Moving towards a just peace, as I say before, requires moving towards a world where we can live together. That means Ukraine as a state has to be able to live internally together as well as externally with the EU, with Russia. And so just peace has to be the question of how do we get there. And you can't get there by radicalizing a country. So my hope is that everybody comes together and negotiates on these issues. It makes it very clear that part of what's required here is to speak bluntly and know where Russia has to change some things. At the same time, I don't have a lot of confidence that that's going to happen. I think the United States in particular is looking at this war as a way of fixing Russian troops in Ukraine for the long term. I think the United States would love to drag this war out for 2 or 3 more decades if they could. I think Europe is finding themselves in a situation where they don't really like their options. And I think that this is going to be something that really should have been a minor conflict that could have been over already, would have required a lot less lives lost on both sides and so forth. But as it's shaping up, it's becoming the most serious geopolitical shift since at least World War I. Arguably bigger than World War II. Arguably bigger than World War I. And it's not because this is such of a big war, it's because the political alliances and so forth of the world are being undermined and unraveled and reshaped by it. You know, the problem here is Russia's bad handling of a bad situation, as well as the United States' effort to take advantage of a bad situation. This is something that the whole rest of the world is going to have to do what they can to contain. Now, I've gone through at this point the dysfunctions within Ukraine. I've gone through what I feel like is almost malicious negligence on the part of Russia. I think next week I should probably try to talk about, based on all the information I can get, what happened at Bucha and who's responsible. And then I'll probably talk about the United States. At any rate, thank you very much, and have a wonderful